Unlike the book of Daniel, that is a collection of narratives, the Aramaic in the book of Ezra looks really different. It's not storytelling or narrative stories or tales or court accounts or fables, whatever genre you place them in. The book of Ezra contains documentation, right? Like official correspondence that's now contextualized by Hebrew. So the think of the book of Ezra as a Hebrew book, right? The book of Ezra is a Hebrew book that has Aramaic parts because it's presenting materials, right, from the outside that it incorporates into the text. You wouldn't theoretically start with the book of Ezra. You'd start with the Aramaic documents, and then you'd have the book of Ezra written around those things, or at least portions of the book of Ezra. It's not going to be the whole thing. So it's really different stylistically than the way Daniel is, and that's reflected in some of the language too. I mean, some of the language of the book of Daniel is quite raw. It's more cinematic, you could say. When you look at the book of Ezra, it's more technical, a lot of Persian terms and jargon that are there, and so it's coming out of an imperial apparatus, right? Like it's coming out of some kind of administrative setting. Although the Aramaic of the Bible is quite limited compared to the Hebrew, it's really two different styles, that give us a nice glimpse into Aramaic. And in fact, when we study biblical Aramaic, for many, that's their first taste of Aramaic. And so it's a nice sort of entry point because you get the narratives of Daniel on one end, and then you get more of the official correspondence on the other. You get different languages. And so if you study additional Semitic languages or additional forms of Aramaic, you really, so you have a nice introduction to genre and different forms of literature. As you're reading the Aramaic portions of the book of Ezra, really take into account that this is official correspondence, right? Like you're reading primary sources in history, right, in a secondary context. So it's taking what would have been a primary source, and then it's placing it in a context that's relevant for the people who are moving back to the land, and what some of their goals are for moving back to the land, what sort of building projects they're engaged in and want to engage in, what that might mean for the Persian government politically, right? Is this something to support, not to support? How does it figure in to the global politics of that day, and really the things we know about the Persian Empire and how they treated, their non-Persian minority communities. And they really have a fascinating history in their approach to call them the conquered peoples, but peoples who the Assyrians and Babylonians had long since dispatched. And one of the reasons is a lot of the materials from that period, they don't survive. I mean, we're lucky to get the Elephantine corpus out of Egypt, but that's because of the type of material is written on and the climate, right? Most of this stuff goes away. It doesn't have a long shelf life, and so it will disintegrate. And what we have preserved in Scripture, are things that, whether they're tooled or not for the religious experience and the religious point, being conveyed by the book of Ezra, we have things that survive because they were preserved for this reason, right? And so they're entirely viewable and appreciable at a historic level, things that we can look at as some kind of primary source, whether you want to put an asterisk by it or or however you want to classify it. I mean, these are things coming out of the empire. And in fact, if you compare some of it with the cylinder of King Cyrus, which I got to see live when it toured California and Los Angeles at the Getty, it's really fascinating that this thing we dug up in history, this thing we dug up that talks about Cyrus's decree to the different peoples and the freedoms he gives them, has parallel material in the Aramaic portions of the book of Ezra. So think of it in terms of order, administration, bureaucracy, history, and then how that can all be utilized toward the spiritual or religious goals in the book of Ezra.